Well, good afternoon. We hope that you're not entering the post-lunch blues because we've got a great panel session for you here to kick off the afternoon. Our first session of the afternoon is covering SCADA. And if you're not from a technical cyber background like myself, SCADA stands for Supervisory, Control, and Data Acquisition Security Systems. The panel moderator is David Thompson, and my job is to introduce David. David is the president and CEO of EdgePoint Limited. He had founded EdgePoint after more than 15 years of experience in Washington, D.C. in the intel, cyber, and defense worlds. He served in the George W. Bush White House and worked for a top lobbying consulting firm in Washington while developing networks on Capitol Hill and across the federal agencies. Before that, David worked at Fox News for Hannity and Colmes and the O'Reilly Factor in New York City. You can talk to him afterwards about that. EdgePoint provides a full suite of consulting services in the areas of cybersecurity, defense, intelligence, homeland security, healthcare, education, international joint ventures, real estate ventures, and others. Please join me in welcoming David Thompson and our panel.
Thank you very much, Paul. Originally I said, look, this is the panel right after lunch, so everybody's going to want to go to bed. We should have you, me, and Ed Scotus and be the three bald amigos talking cyber. That idea got shot down, so we have this discussion on SCADA. To frame the discussion a little bit, one thing I want to do with this panel is take a step back. The interesting thing about watching these cyber symposiums over the years, I've been going to them for about 10 years, and 10 years ago, it would have only been technical people in the audience. It would have been the ones and zeros, the keystrokers, the CIOs, CTOs, and they would all be sitting around talking about the problems that they have. Well, the only challenge there is that there's a lot of CEOs and COOs and other non-technical people in industry and government, and they need to understand this problem too in order to move the needle. And the conferences tended to get a little too in the weeds, and so what I wanted to do with this panel, this very distinguished panel, except for Chris Cleary, I don't know who let him in the room, but nobody knows Chris, so that wasn't as funny as it is to me. But I want to start technical, and Daryl's going to provide a really fascinating rundown on what SCADA is and why we should be concerned with it. But then I want to take a step back and talk about why it's important. And we're using SCADA as an example, but the real thing, the message here, for those of you in the audience that might not be technically savvy or strong in a technical background, is for your institution, for the security of your institution, why do we need to focus on these things? Why it's important to listen to your tech teams and come up with a common lexicon where you can communicate with them effectively, and then take a step back even further to look at how that impacts policy. And of course, as Paul said, my background is from the policy angle in Washington, and we have a policy structure that is incredibly slow-moving, and cyber, as we all know, is very fast-moving. So that's a significant challenge to come up with sound policy to respond to a dynamically changing and asymmetrical environment. So that's where we'll start. So I'll just let the panelists go down and introduce themselves, starting with you, Daryl, if you want to kick it off.
Sure. So Daryl Higley with the Department of Defense, with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment. It did not include cyber in its title, and we are trying to figure out what the role is within cybersecurity in that, and I look forward to sharing you what we've discovered so far.
Chris Cleary, I'm currently with Tenable Network Security. I manage their cyber portfolio for the Department of Defense. But I think the real reason David brought me up on this panel was not as much what we do in the private industry, although there is a correlation to that. But my background is a 24-year naval intelligence officer doing mostly cyber. Kind of stood up U.S. Cyber Command, ran one of their more edgier teams doing things against one of our larger nation-state adversaries, and then deployed to Iraq for a period of time running Mission Forward. And that's going to relate back to, I think, the SCADA discussion when we get to it.
I'm John Gallagher, retired from the Army last year after 25 years. Spent half my career sleeping in the mud, jumping out of airplanes. The second half working in policy jobs at the National Security Council, for Bush and Obama, and then as an advisor to several four-star level commands, ending with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon. I now work in capital management on Wall Street. I mention that because the private sector looks very closely at technologies like this and how they can help move the needle on U.S. national security from outside of the government. And I'm here to talk a little bit about that nexus between policy and strategy inside of government, and then the relationship and role that the private sector plays to protect this nation and our assets in the cyber domain.
That's great. Thank you all very much for being here. So to kick it off, Daryl, why don't you explain to the audience what SCADA is, why it's important, and how cyber fits into the overarching picture.
Okay, looking forward to doing that, and I've got some slides to help bring that to your, so you get a better understanding of this, and where this is a cybersecurity that many of you have not really considered, or maybe you have, but you're not sure where it fits. So as you see up here, we've gone through warfare in different stages, and we've progressed with, of course, somebody thinking that they've developed the next weapon that's going to defeat the one that's been used before. And as you can see now, we're using technology to launch that. So it shows keyboards here, so what's going to be next? Something is going to be next, and it's not going to be anything that you've seen here. So what is that? Where do these control systems that we use and depend upon exist? So as was mentioned earlier, you heard the word SCADA, and that can put people to sleep right away because they say, I don't do SCADA. That's big utility stuff, energy generation. So I don't need to worry about it, I don't do it. Well, it's part of a greater set of a number of different terms, and maybe some of you heard of some of these. Who's heard of operational technology? Okay, who's heard of cyber physical systems that NIST is coming out and wants to call these things? Control systems. Who's heard of platform information technology? UGG, right? I mean, that's a leave over from some of the old DoD CIO days. You were either information systems, which is what we've all talked about so far, or you are now PIT. You're a platform information technology. And that was difficult for somebody who was on a weapons platform, and then somebody who's running a building, and somebody's running a wastewater management treatment center. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to call this, and anybody who has a better idea for another term, feel free. All right. So what do we do as a policy office? We are here to give clear guidance and direction, right? And so one of the things in the Department of Defense, I'm told, well, Daryl, you're talking critical infrastructure, so why doesn't U.S. Cyber Command defend these systems? They don't. It's not their role to defend these systems. It's not within their purview to come in and defend your infrastructure network. It's not their role. Just recently, there's congressional language to have the Department of Defense evaluate the grid, but before that, that is not the Department of Defense's role to review these. So if it is not your role to protect these systems, how much along do you think you are with developing the right skills, requirements, and technologies? Probably not as far as you'd like us all to be. Anyway, how reliant are we on these systems? You know where these are. If you've never seen one, this is a program logic controller. It's in all these different environments. This same program logic controller can be in each one of these environments. But your IT folks typically don't know how to program something that comes in with Ethernet and out with copper wires. Different protocols. So who works in a building? I mean, seriously, who does not work in a building? Now, what we're finding is, as we're becoming more technologically advanced, we want to network things, we are connecting these systems. There are many more connections in a building than on your IT network. So whose job is it to protect that? This is a great stat from the Department of Homeland Security. So when they have gone out and they have looked at people who have had problems on their control system networks, they have this number, and this number is a good number. I mean, who wants to go tell your boss, Hey, look, they've only been on our network 245 days before we knew about it. Who thinks that's cool? Well, it is cool because it used to be 410, right? Yeah, we're way better than average. Okay, it just gives you a sense of this. So here, quickly, get ready to schedule an optometrist appointment right away because of these slides. Okay, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. These are from the Navy's doing their control systems inventory. So these are the types of vendors that they have. These are the different types of software. And then these are the devices that are in the walls, on the pumps, and throughout the network. Is this more complicated or less complicated than your IT problem? Right? Yes. And then, when we've gone and looked at these systems, we've discovered that a lot of them are still using Windows XP or other unsupported operating system. Who thinks that's a problem? Who thinks we can just throw Windows 10 on it and solve it? No, right? Okay. So, quick example. Has anyone heard of Shodan? Okay. So, I recommend that you ask permission first, get the proper requirements so you can go and look at your own networks. But this is what it was designed for, to find stuff that's already connected to the internet that's within your purview. So it can do a bunch of different things, medical devices, whatever. So I just stop on buildings. You can stop for a default password. Show me all the buildings connected to the internet with a default password. How cool is that, right? And then you could look for a common one, Tritium Niagara, and then it'll give you all these links, okay? And then if you click on them, you could get this screen. Default password, right? And you know what that is. So should we worry about that here? So we did it for this college, and we found something on Tritium Niagara. Okay, and I covered up the IP address because if I tell you not to go where this IP address is, what's everyone going to do? All right, so what do? Then it came up with this screen. Okay, and then has anybody used Tulip before? If you're like, oh, well, where is this? All right, so you go to Tulip. It gives you your screen, and that's a made-up IP address right there. Okay, so bring it in here, it brings you in here, and then here is where it is, somewhere in a college. And so when you get there, this is what you could do. You could turn off this system or make adjustments, right? How cool is that? And then if you want to do some more open source looking, you can say, well, what kind of systems could that be? And then you're looking for someone who knows Amarok because that's what you have here, right? And that's good. And what I reiterate is to people is to try and know your systems better than adversaries, because it shouldn't be the other way around. This is one of the problems from vendors. Love the vendors, couldn't do work without you, but this continues to be a problem. You continue to have default passwords listed, and we continue to find them. That's not good. So I'm going to run through some of the dependencies and things that we work with the Department of Defense to get to a couple really quick, interesting things. So who cares about their financial trust score? Nobody anymore? Doesn't matter? Okay. Well, so there is a cyber trust score for your organization right now, whether you know about it or not. Has anybody heard of BitSite? There's a couple of them like that, and this is not the only one. This is just the data I have. But essentially, they are taking a look at some of the things here, botnet infections, malware. They're looking at all the open source pathways that are happening. They're related to your IP range and giving you a score. Okay? So here are, Daryl, what are your top companies that you do business with the Department of Defense, and here are their scores. Now, Department of Defense, why do I want to do business with anybody with a 300 or 400 score? I could start making my decisions based on that. And some people who have cyber insurance and raise their hand because they know, because cyber insurance is basing their amount of what you pay based on these kind of scores. Anyway. I want to just throw just a couple of other things that you should care about in this area. NASA, they're pretty important, right? So they didn't update their patches right. They had a fire in their oven. Anybody heard of Kaspersky now? That's getting removed from everybody's software. When you hear big potential hacks on the grids, anybody all get excited? No, not really, because you don't run them, right? But what about here in the Chamber of Commerce? They converted a digital thermostat to a microphone in their conference room. How cool is that? Who's going to now try and do that, right? And what I ask is, well, whose job was it to fix that? And the CIO folks, it's not to say it's that them, and then your facility energy managers say it's not theirs, right? So whose job is it? Anybody have fish tanks? Anybody have them connected wirelessly? So here was an opportunity where one was able to get into the, potentially get into casino network. Car wash hack, I don't know if you've heard that. That's where you could trap someone in a car wash. I don't know, you're going to start instituting, put chips in people's arms? We could do that. That could save a lot of time at at getting food, right? Bug bounties, we can go over that later. Amazon delivers now when you're not home. So where is the cyber terrain? You know, when we have something forward deployed, controlling things over a space network, it comes down to information systems, data rooms, and into a building which depend upon the HVAC and the chillers to make sure that happens. So anyway, so I just want to leave that as kind of setting the stage, and the real technical experts are going to tell you a little bit more about why we should be concerned about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. Puts us all at ease, I'm sure. So, Chris, as an offensive cyber operational planner, taking this as an example, how would you come about this as an adversary?
So I guess I didn't have my microphone on in the beginning, so I'll just go over my background for just a little bit. So I cut my teeth in this area mostly back in 2008 when U.S. Cybercom wasn't even an organization yet. And at the time, they'd stood up what they call operational planning teams to look at both the offensive and defensive side of either things that we know the adversary was looking at us. Critical infrastructure was one of them, particularly with our larger nation-state adversaries, or things that we would want to go do against our adversaries. And at the time, it was in areas like in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was mostly around counterterrorism efforts, but there were also larger planning things going on and are still going on. The interesting thing back then in 2008 through almost 2013, we didn't even use the words offensive cyber operations. Even inside of SCIFs or sensitive compartment information facilities, we did not even like to say the words computer network attack. In 2013, when we established the National Mission Force, which was sort of the operator component of U.S. Cyber Command, we said we have 3 clearly defined missions. We do defensive network operations, offensive network operations, and we basically build and maintain the Department of Defense Information Network, or our infrastructure that we operate in. Darrell said a very interesting thing. Yes, right this minute, U.S. Cybercom's mission is as follows: to defend the Department of Defense Information Network, and when directed, which is a very important part of that sentence, ensure our freedom of maneuver in cyberspace while denying the same to our adversaries. So it's a very broad thing. The National Mission Force was stood up to potentially respond to things outside the Department of Defense, again, when directed by higher authority. So right now there are guys out there planning to try and do these things. We have exercises annually. There's one that's called Cyber Guard, which is basically a big exercise where the Department of Defense works with mostly National Guard units to simulate a large attack on the country where you get Guard and reservists that sort of come in response to other authorities they have within their states to respond to these problems. Well, here's the interesting and I'll argue scarier thing. All of those things that Darrell just pointed out are very possible. The scary thing is you have people now being trained professionally in the DoD and in these other countries to figure out where those very, very interesting points of presence are, or aim points that I would like to focus on to deliver what we call in the DoD effects. Now, effects are things to degrade, deny, destroy, disrupt, usually in conjunction with some other larger activity we're trying to plan, either a maneuver element, a direct attack. But the plan is that, I'd like to say in the security world, we tend to confuse the words security and defense. And in this world, we use those words interchangeably all the time, and I argue they're not. To secure something, I make the argument, is to lock this building. We're going to secure it. We're going to make sure the doors are locked, the windows are locked, everything's closed. We're not going to get water in here, and nobody's just going to arbitrarily walk in the door. But this building's secured. If I show up at 2 o'clock in the morning with a sledgehammer, I'm getting in. You're not going to prevent me from getting in this building unless you're prepared to defend it, or even impose some cost to me that I am not willing to accept. Now, theoretically, it's a crime and I shouldn't do that, and if I got caught, I'm going to jail. That might be a cost that I'm willing to accept based on the value of whatever is in here that I'm trying to get. So when we start looking at the way that we defend systems, what we tend to overlook is the adversary gets a vote. So what the adversary does is looks at all these different things that are potential aim points, and the way that they go about doing it is they start with center of gravity analysis. Now let's use critical infrastructure as a great center of gravity, electrical power distribution. That might be the thing I have to do, and every center of gravity is made up of certain capabilities. So let's, in a critical infrastructure instance, let's say the three main capabilities is produce power, distribute power, control both those efforts. Well, with each of those capabilities, there are certain requirements that feed each of those. You need people to work there. You need command and control devices. You need generation of electricity. You need lines to physically distribute it. You need SCADA controls that maybe control how that's going about. Well, each of those things, when you start looking at it, ultimately you start finding those vulnerabilities that were pointed out. So I'll look for a vulnerability that affects a requirement that feeds a capability that affects the center of gravity. And when I can put that together, again, I only have to be right once. I encourage everybody who here is particularly interested in electrical power distribution to read the Electrical ISAC, or the Information Security and Analysis Center, released a very interesting study on the Ukrainian power attacks that happened 3-4 years ago. I got the dates mixed up. And it's interesting, and it walks you through how the adversary they got access, they built tools, they moved laterally, they pre-positioned capability, and then ultimately they shut off the power. Now here's the so what. The people in those environments say, well, the power was only off for 3 hours. It simply required guys to go out to 3 substations and reset breakers. But for a period of 3 hours, the power was out. The very end of the report says, but guys, we're missing probably the most important part of all this. Nobody to this day knows why the power went out. So it's the why the power went out was the important thing. Not that I reset it in 3 hours. That operator, whoever planned that mission for whatever reason, you could say they might have done that for everything from a signaling operation to simply demonstrate that they had the capability to do it, which is an interesting thing. Oh man, they might be able to turn my power off. Maybe I don't want to cross swords with them. Everything to, no, it was done for a specific time for a specific reason, because I'm making this up as an example, but let's just say from a military maneuver standpoint, there was no moonlight, so there was no illumination that night. You kill the power, you get a period of darkness. This lasts for 3 hours. You have some sort of special mission force that uses that period of darkness to go in and conduct some sort of mission, and then they retreat within the period of darkness. They may only have needed 45 minutes to carry out that operation. But the planner said, hey, look, I might be able to give you as much as a 3-hour window. I'll definitely give you an hour, but maybe I'll give you as much to 3. And they'll say, well, I only need 45 minutes. Perfect. That went into some larger planning process. And then some commander made a decision saying, yes, we're going to leverage this effect to turn those lights off to enable this group to conduct some mission. So again, and I'll get off the stage and let the policy guys kind of talk about it, but that is the scariest thing. The scariest thing is that we are now in a world where not only people know how to leverage certain vulnerabilities, but they're leveraging them specifically to derive certain effects to achieve other end states.
That's a great segue to try to define, John, what constitutes a legitimate target in cyber?
Yes.
Thanks, David.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to stand here. I have some notes and about 3 or 4 slides. I'll talk beyond the slides. But great segue, because what we really have to do is ask ourselves, after we've heard a little bit about the capabilities that we have, and we heard a little bit about the doctrine, how we address these vulnerabilities. How does it all fit? Meaning, how do leaders and policymakers understand this domain? And are we ahead of our adversaries in this domain? Are we playing catch up? And you heard Max say this morning, sometimes we unleash a capability and then we try to reverse engineer how that capability is going to be used or protected or employed. And this is a little bit of a primer to the conversation that I'll be a part of with Dr. Mark Wells after this about sort of the ethics and leadership required in the cyber domain. Next, oh, I've got the SCADA. All right, how do I go back? My slides aren't working here. I deliberately put some color up there and toys since it was after lunch. I don't know how I got to my last slide already. So just read this for a moment. If you're asking yourself, what are we doing here? Is this just a big conversation that leads nowhere? I would submit these types of dialogues help us to avoid this. So we're dealing with some very complex problems, and these are not problems that government can solve alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the big ideas, high altitude, and how do we get down to some of the remarks that we've just heard. How do we understand this problem in the context of everything else we have to deal with? Look, if you're writing a national security strategy, it's nothing more than a strategy to secure the nation. And bring in a little bit of DC here, for better or worse, we kind of look at as every nation has fundamental interests, threats to those interests, a strategy to defeat the threats, and forces and resources available to execute the strategy to defeat the threats to preserve the national interests. We sometimes use this little moniker up there, 2221. We say there are two heavyweights, China, Russia, two middleweights or rogue states, North Korea, Iran, two networks, transnational terror network, transnational criminal network, and one domain, cyber. And of course, the cyber domain extends into all the others. I probably would add a second domain, what I think is going to happen with the exploding drone technology. I think it's not just going to be a capability that certain actors use. I think it's going to become its own sort of network and domain that we're hardly equipped to deal with, even less position to deal with than where we stand in cyber. So we know strategy is the alignment of ends, ways, and means, the military instrument among all instruments of national power, economics, diplomacy, intelligence. It is often reached for, sometimes prematurely. So we say the military instrument has to be rightly sequenced, rightly integrated, and rightly proportioned when used in a sort of whole of national power response to a complex problem. Assurance and deterrence are very important. Our ability to assure our allies means that they won't hedge against us and write our role out of their national security strategies. And the ability to deter our adversaries credibly means we don't have to actually go and engage and fight all around the world, only the ones who are not deterred. This is very important. And then I ask, what about gray zone conflict? And this is really the next step to how we get to the cyber domain. What we mean when we talk about the gray zone, imagine the United States post-World War II, but just imagine since the Cold War ended. We have been so dominant in the conventional space of war that it makes sense. It's just basic market behavior that, let's say, non-state actors who can't compete with us in conventional warfare would move into this gray zone between war and peace, and they would compete with us with terrorism or cyber attacks or some other subversive things that elude sort of traditional capabilities that we have to win wars. It took us a while to realize this in the 2000s, and now we pat ourselves on the back. We know non-state actors are in the gray zone, and we're developing our capability to counter them there. The problem is we're so good in the conventional realm of war that forget non-state actors. State actors, great powers like China and Russia and North Korea, they're all moving into the gray zone as well. We don't get challenged by Iran conventionally or China or Russia. We get provocations, subversion, coercion, things that aren't fully attributable to these states, support for terrorism, cyber attacks, all of these behaviors by actual states with a return address coming into the gray zone because they have a better sort of balance of power against the United States there. So we've got to learn how to operate in that space and quickly, and non-state actors aren't the only ones we face in that zone. And so we've experienced over the last few years shrinking capability gaps, and I'll let you Google it if you care, we are undertaking what is called the third offset right now in DoD. There's been two previous offsets since World War II. One is trying to offset our abilities relative to our enemies in intercontinental ballistic missile technology. Later it was smart munitions, 20 years ago. And now the third offset is about innovation, drones, cyber, and staying one step ahead of our adversaries, essentially in this domain. We are putting a lot of money into the third offset. It's been going on since 2014. It's the kind of thing that will get handed from president to president. It's a big deal. And what we're talking about today is actually part of that offset. So I would submit to all of you, in any big headquarters trying to solve complex problems, very few people actually work at this nexus. Intelligence, operations, policy, and the public narrative. You can work with intel guys, you can work with operators, you can work with those who make policy, you can work with those who manage the public narrative and do media and press and outreach and everything else. But there's a handful of people in the Pentagon and these other headquarters that work at the nexus of all four of these things. And if you think now about the cyber domain and you look up there, intel, ops, policy, and the public narrative, I think of the motto of this conference, which is it's awareness, assessment, action. The awareness and assessment is in the intel circle. The action is the operations that we're doing. But the whole reason this exists, this event exists, is to make us better at establishing policy and better at engaging sort of like the legitimacy or outward-facing narrative of what we're trying to do, and it requires leaders who can operate in that middle space. So it's not just a technology story. This is a leadership issue. It's an ethical issue. We struggle enough in conventional warfare working at that nexus. Cyber's even harder. So as someone who spent 12 years in policymaking in DC, I can tell you that whenever we approach a really complex problem, and most of the government agencies are on the same sheet of music, so imagine the State Department, Congress, Department of Defense, National Security Council, Treasury, we start high-fiving, everybody tears up, we're gonna solve the problem, it's a whole of government approach, we did it. The problem is, the issues that we're facing out in the world are not solved by government. There are these three-dimensional nasty problems that require us to work around the corners with the private sector, with academia, with religious leaders, with the media, even with NGOs and nonprofits, and everybody has to participate in this kind of problem solving. There aren't a lot of leaders that are comfortable working on all sides of the cube. I can't solve a Rubik's Cube. I'm certain that these guys probably can, many of you. You don't solve one side and then look at the condition of the other sides, because you wind up undoing that. It's not really progress. You have to be aware of all the sides of the cube as you move forward to sort of solve that bigger problem. And this requires working across lines: civilian, military, government, civil society, public, private. As I'm reading this list, you should just be thinking, the cyber domain covers all this. And so what I'm going to talk about for no more than 4 or 5 more minutes, and then we'll have 10 or 12 minutes for questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this domain represents to us in terms of disruption. So think about what the threat from terrorism did to disrupt sort of our existing systems. Does anybody think we're crystal clear on how to do law of war detention when you seize a combatant from the battlefield who is sort of a combatant and sort of a civilian who has bad ties to terror groups, and you put them in detention in Gitmo or wherever, and you say, like any soldier we took from the battlefield, they stay detained for the remainder of the war. And as soon as I say that, everybody's thinking, how long is this war? Is that guy fully a combatant? Are we right? Is this law enforcement? Do we need to present a trial for this guy? There are so many areas where terrorism has blurred the lines and disrupted the way we do war. Cyber is doing exactly the same thing. Cyber is challenging our understanding of some principles that we might find in for example, just war theory, or how we look at ethics generally in other sectors, whether it's medical ethics, ethics in the financial sector, ethics meaning rules of engagement on the ground. You know, you can't kill a prisoner of war. You have to allow for surrender, humane treatment, everything else. If you take a look at how we might apply things that we count on in just war theory to cyber, it doesn't even really fit. And yet we want to come up with these norms and we want to come up with constraints on warfare in the cyber domain, but it's difficult to do. So we all remember, right? Use ad bellum, use in bello, use ad bellum, just cause to even engage in war. Use in bello is just means. When you're in war, think of some of these concepts. Use of force must be waged by legitimate authority. It must be applied for a just cause, not merely self-interest. It requires proportionality. It requires a goal of returning to a state of peace. And war or the use of force should be a last resort. Cyber attacks are not waged always by people who we would consider to have legitimate authority to make war. You want to talk about the goal of restoring peace? Cyber attacks oftentimes are a tit for tat, or they're a one strike. The minute hostilities occur doesn't mean that you're in a state of war for a prolonged period of time. The idea that you would not use this type of aggression unless it was a last resort, that doesn't even really hold up, because it's a little bit different than the use of force. You could almost argue you're obeying the use of the last resort doctrine by using cyber, because you're using an option short of physical force. And so it really starts to blur the lines. If you look at the jus in bello requirements, non-combatant immunity, I mean, these guys can tell you better than I can. Some of the most high-value targets is our financial sector. J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, others. These are civilian targets. It's like bombing Dresden in World War II. The idea that if a nation violates the sovereignty of another nation and attacks, and we have a responsibility maybe to make it known that J.P. Morgan was attacked, then think about all the money they're going to lose as their shareholders lose confidence, for example, in their mission. So do we then obscure the knowledge of this attack from the American public? At what point does another nation or another entity's attack on a civilian institution require us to engage in punitive measures that maybe even get out of the cyber realm and into the kinetic? These are all very difficult questions. So let me wrap up by saying, one, this is a conversation we need to keep having. Two, I applaud Montreat, President Maurer, and others for bringing people together to talk about what does it look like to really lead and answer these tough questions, but then let the United States serve as an example to sort of like build the normative and legal structure around the world for how conflict and competition takes place in the cyber realm. And then finally, I would say to all of you, but particularly to the students, the changing character of war, particularly in this realm, demands that you step up, not just be aware and assess and take action, but advise and adhere and abide and assure that we know how to lead in this domain. And what that means is, I sort of call it like the Yoda principle. When war's paradigm is changing, then the senior-most people don't always have the best instincts on what to do. And when the paradigm has existed for 30 years, then the really old guy or woman who's been in the fight forever, they always have the best instincts, the best ideas. They can lead. But when the paradigm has shifted, there's a level of expert, there's a level of policymaker below the senior-most people that have the best instincts and the best thinking on how to move ahead. And then it's your job to know if you're that person, and you have to be bold and step forward to enable your principle to make good decisions so that we can lead in this area as we need to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And especially on that last point, I think it's really important. You know, Chris, you and I have discussed this many times, and Daryl, I'm sure you've seen it. There's kind of a cultural shift at DoD in particular, where the junior officers that are now coming up through the ranks have a much better understanding of this battle space than the senior leadership. And the senior leadership's, it's kind of, you know, back in Gulf War I, there was famous Norman Schwarzkopf, couldn't stand the special forces. There's snake eaters. I don't want to be bothered with conventional. And then the paradigm shifted. How long is it going to take for that to shift completely, or will it ever?
So I wanted to tell a story based on exactly what John just finished with, and that I can tell you we were living that. When I came back from Iraq, and as they were standing up the reserve unit that was going to support the cyber element, they put a bunch of us mid to 04, 05 officers in a room and said, hey, figure out what it is this unit should do in the future. And we came up, and like any good, we came up with a list of 10 things, and we were briefing it out to the group of guys. And one of the guys in the audience said, hey, Chris, that thing number 6 up on the board, the last time that was written on a whiteboard, that guy found his head on a pike outside of General Alexander's office because it was heresy. It wasn't even to be whispered. Now, if you look at, that was 2011, 2012. If you fast forward that a little bit, and I actually had the opportunity to tell General Alexander this when he went into private sector, and I told him this story, and I said, sir, the problem is that you're not going to be you forever. It's only a matter of time before one of us are you, and we think this is a good idea. and not that it's not a good idea, it's maybe, to John's point exactly, you just can't get your head around it because you don't understand the space. But there's a younger generation that not only understands the space, thinks about it differently, but is much more capable because they're growing up as digital natives. So the idea of enacting something like that might even be able to be done responsibly in a way that it can be controlled, as opposed to something that is just horrible to think about because it's the perception is there's a bunch of young guys running around with scissors. So there's two ways to look at it. You can either put faith in a younger generation that they're going to do the right thing, and it's that Ender's Game analogy, to provide them with the right sort of training and guidance and mentoring, but allow them to go do probably what it is they're going to be good at. Because if you have to wait a decade for them to be in charge, there's going to be a whole new way of thinking in this space that even that generation can't quite get their head around.
So if I can, so this is now known as the fifth domain. The fifth warfare domain is cybersecurity. And, someone who's been tracking U.S. Cybercom is now becoming, its own combatant commander and going to have authority to do things it never had before. And that's just happening now. And we're still trying to figure out where it falls within the offense-defensive realm, how it's supported by the other agencies. So it is evolving, and I agree, not as fast as we would all like to see.
So we've gotten a number of questions from the audience, which I'll go through and just open this up to the panel, whoever would like to answer it. But the first is, what joint task forces have been explored to give civilians the most security without sacrificing privacy?
I don't know about a formal joint task force, but I can say we've invested when I was at the Pentagon, we took the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey, and he came in as the Army chief and said, look, I'm joint now. I need to know about cyber. Put me through a campaign of learning, if you will. And we brought in all the cyber experts you can imagine. He listened and he learned. On the last question, it's a little bit about humility. The leader's the best at adjudicating competing recommendations from expertise and experts that he or she is not. So they get to have that space still. They're still the smartest person in the room on that, decision-making and adjudicating. But just the topic area, they need to be humble and learn. And this is what General Dempsey was willing to do. And in the process, what we found out is the information sharing between the private sector and the public sector was completely insufficient, and everybody was risk averse and pushed and pushed and pushed for legislation that would do that. I think some legislation came out in 2015. I don't know how good it is or not. You guys would know. But the point is, it's a bit of a two-way street. There are a lot of civilian institutions or even like citizens who would prefer to not devote the resources to be safe, and they want to hide in plain sight. And then by hiding in plain sight, like Sony, for example, they get attacked by North Korea, and then the cries go up, Department of Defense, what are you doing to protect these major industries? Right. So it really is a two-way street, and threading the needle on respect for civil liberties and privacy, but then also, accomplishing sort of this is the stuff of democracy and public debate, and thank God that those are our institutions and they allow for that. And if we set the dial wrong, there are ways to come back and reset the dial. So I'm not worried about that part.
Are we working on laws that work to support efforts to, instead of attempting to exploit vulnerabilities like Stuxnet, require disclosure and warning to make us all safer? Similarly, strengthening versus weakening encryption.
Go right ahead.
The strengthening and weakening encryption thing is not really my, forte. The law part, though, this gets back into what John was saying with information sharing. There's always been that attempt to do information sharing, and I know I was saying this at lunch, and I know we've been talking about the public-private partnership for a long time, and I kind of make the joke like, oh my God, if I hear that one more time, I'm going to strangle somebody because it's this go-to thing. Well, the public-private partnership is going to solve this. Well, it is going to solve it, but there's still a trust base that hasn't completely been established. Because a lot of the private companies say, well, I'm afraid of giving some information over because what if I'm held accountable because something that I didn't do to fix the system had maybe an effect, particularly in the critical information or in the SCADA environment. I think we're still a little ways out from that full trust model being established.
And on the encryption piece, I would say that this is, of course, an ongoing debate, and it's something that has been very, there's very good arguments on both sides. I would say that Chairman Burr, Senator Burr, who is the senior senator of North Carolina and chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was here at this event last year talking about encryption a little bit. And his committee has been taking this under consideration with industry for the last 2 years, and I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion. But the problem is, yes, we all agree that encryption has to be, there has to be ways for the good guys to find bad guys, and so that means that encryption in its strongest form is going to be an issue. But how do you create legislation? And of course, we're always, as policymakers, we're always concerned with the downstream effects of what we do. There are always unintended consequences in legislation. How do we create legislation that is modular enough to amend over time so that as technologies change, the laws don't need to be revised and updated all the time? So it's a challenging debate that I don't see it.
David, I actually want to follow up on something that John said, and I think this is an interesting point. One of the things that we haven't really done a good job establishing where those lines of demarcation are of what an individual should be responsible for on their own and where they should expect help. As an example, this building's built to code, and I'm sure there's a fire extinguisher somewhere. If there was a small fire, we as able-bodied human beings should be able to pick up a fire extinguisher and put it out. But if this whole building caught on fire, we're not expected to put the building out, even though there's hoses on this ground. We probably could find the water, but it very quickly goes out of our capacity to control. That's why we have the fire department. That's why we have trained professionals to respond to those things. And I think one of the criticisms of the security industry, me being a part of it, and I'll point the finger at me a little bit, is we push a lot of technology out and give you the perception that if you buy this and install it in your infrastructure, you're going to be okay. And sometimes that's just not the fact because there's a level of professionalism required to use that stuff. The Sony one is a great example because they found themselves in the crosshairs of a nation state. I would argue there's not a private company, a bank, a critical infrastructure that if it finds itself in the crosshairs of a nation state, especially some of our more sophisticated nation states, could have a reasonable expectation that they can defend their infrastructure long enough to prevent that guy from achieving whatever it is he's doing. There has to be a point where we would expect a company, okay, you're not a company, you're a little bit bigger than a fire, maybe you have a small little fire brigade on your compound, but there comes a point when you pull the fire alarm in 911 and they send ambulances and things with red flashy lights. And I think we got to do a better job of trying to explain to people what they should be capable of responding to, and when that is too much. And on top of that, what is that expectation management that whatever that service that's going to provide you a response effort is, and how should you expect to receive it? What should you expect to do for you? We're very far away from that. But I believe that providing everybody tools and just expecting that this is going to be enough to save you is a misrepresentation.
So a couple last questions, and then I'll finish up with a question for each of you, but that's a good segue. Who can define what cybercrimes are across international boundaries, and how can punishment be enforced? So North Korea attacking Sony is, of course, a good example.
And the question was, define?
Who can define what cybercrimes are across international boundaries and how punishment can be enforced?
Well, I think we're going through trying to define that right now. I mean, that line has not been explicitly defined, and who will take what action and what the roles are and what you should do on your own is still under debate. So that is progressing.
For anybody who's interested in picking up a book, the Talon Manual is a really interesting reference to it's a group of experts that came together to kind of define what norms in cyber look like as they comply to laws of armed conflict, rules of Geneva Convention, rules of engagement. It's not case law, it's not defined, it's not policy anywhere, but it's an interesting starting point.
And
there's an expert, I'm sorry,
no,
an expert named Peter Singer, a futurist, and he writes about this, and he says, do we know the difference between a prank, a probe, a political protest, some action that you take, theft, lasting damage, espionage, and like the destruction of a node of American power, whether it's economic or military or intelligence? And that's a bit of a spectrum just kind of like rattled off.
Right. Yep.
But I mean, we would do well to have some nuance on how we're going to report and respond and classify and even train our institutions and leaders to recognize and guard against this spectrum. We wouldn't want to react to a prank. We also wouldn't want to neglect, an espionage or some damage.
So I wanted to finish with a few notes, but I got to note that we're to be kicked off stage. Our time is up. So thank you very much to everybody on the panel. Really appreciate it. I think it was very good insight and also shows the complexity of this, not just from the ones and zeros, but obviously there's enormous policy and all kinds of other challenges that this space gives us that we've got to figure out, and we've got to figure it out fast. So thank you very much to everybody.
You're going to help us figure it out. Thanks.